squad. Approaching position.
As per our community votes, we are going to be looking at MGS 5 today and giving a security analysis of a specific location within the Afghanistan region. And we're going to see and compare how real Soviets did in the 1984 or so Afghanistan compared to what they do in MGS 5. Hello again, and welcome back. Lead Instructor Lespino with Spear Training Group. We are going to be looking over the most voted next in line for our security analysis. If you're interested in this particular content, be sure to vote on the next one. I have a very long list of these things, and instead of me picking them, I like to throw it to the community and just see what they're interested in. We'll do the same thing for our weaponry designs. Not the purpose of what we're doing here today, though. So we're going to be looking at MGS 5 and a security analysis of some of the positions within game that exist. Now, we have to get a few contexts out of the way first. If you're new here, you're really going to need to know this part. Video games, movies, whatever, are designed with the rule of cool. Sometimes rule of cool means rule of gameplay. Point of being, it's designed to be fun and interactive. With that note, whenever we create something cool, we need it to be justified in lore sometimes. That way it's more believable. If you have a less serious game or a less serious movie, less justification is necessary. Be it something as convoluted as Metal Gear Solid and all of the variations that come with that, there is a lot of lore. What I try to do whenever I do these analyses is I acknowledge that it's created for rule of cool and rule of gameplay. And I am going to lean it in the direction of lore. This is going to be me looking at some of the timeline specifics, some of the technology, some of the training standards, whatever may exist in lore that may influence my assessment. And then I am going to take it away and point it towards practicality or realism. What does that mean? I'm going to be applying legitimate security practices and documentation and training standards to a fictional world. Why am I doing this? Because I just enjoy it and I can do what I want. Also, because I think this type of analysis gives video game designers and people in the real world a slightly alternative perspective on how to view their security perimeter and how they can be compromised. For example, if we look at Metal Gear Solid, for example, we're going to see a few baked in holes in the perimeter of the facility we're going to be looking at. If those were hardened properly, as if they really would have been, how could Snake or whoever else compromise that facility and the perimeter? They would need to be more crafty. Now I acknowledge a hole in a fence is made for gameplay balance. Point being, a legitimate security perimeter, especially depending on how hard they lean into security, would take care of that hole in the fence and making it harder for an infiltrator. Now that we have our nice little triangle out of the way, let's talk about the convenience to security threshold here. The most convenient experience would be kind of like a convenience store. You just walk in, you walk out. Nobody's checking you at the front, nothing like that. A extremely high security standard would be you're getting checked before you even turn down the road. You're being checked before you park. You're being checked as you walk in, and you're being checked as you're making your way through the hallways, and you're being checked before you go into some random office of some random anywhere along the way. You are being monitored by multiple surveillance systems or access controls or whatever the case may be. You're talking hardened security perimeters that maybe have specialized blocking materials that block out certain type of frequencies or other detection methods. There is a threshold. If we lean too far into security, it is no longer a practical assessment. It is no longer a realistic assessment. For example, we would not lean this far into a security assessment if what we're trying to secure wasn't of extreme value. Simultaneously, what we're going to be looking at today is going to be a power plant. This is not something that needs to be left just unsecure, so we shouldn't make it easier to access that type of facility. Now you understand our goal. Now, why would something not lean into security? One, it doesn't need to, but also there's a cost-benefit analysis there. Whenever it comes to private entities, be it you're a company owner or maybe you're a military force, whatever the case is, you have to invest resources into security. And security is a very hard justification of resources. For example, some individuals who don't quite understand the impact good security can have look at security as just a loss of profits. It's like, oh, why am I paying for this service? They don't bring in any money, they just cost me money. Well, it's a protection against loss. The better your security procedures and postures and perimeters, the less loss that you're going to have overall. For example, a security guard doesn't just keep bad guys out, they're also looking for a slip hazard. And if your valuable employee slips and bumps their head and now they're out for 2 weeks and maybe they're looking at some workman comp claims, you're now out a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of profitability that could have just been solved by a well-trained security officer. So security goes much more in depth than just keeping bad guys out. So now we understand the threshold. We need to invest enough to secure our facility, but not so much that we're taking away from the primary mission of the zone. So let's identify some of those things. What we are going to be looking at today is actually going to be the Solwani power plant. I'll throw it in there in text. And the Afghanistan region of Metal Gear Solid 5. Now, both for the algorithm and the viewers, I need to provide a disclaimer. This is a security analysis of a fictional environment applying real security techniques. We are not going to compromise real security facilities by pointing out their weaknesses or their flaws and telling them where they could be better. Instead, we are going to look at a fictional universe to apply real security techniques. If this applies to you and your real world needs, hopefully you learn something here and apply it yourself. If you're a game designer trying to make more realistic worlds, hopefully it works that way for you as well. Point being, this is all a fictional analysis. We will not be giving away legitimate practices in depth. I'm not going to tell you super trade secrets of some random industry, in this case a power plant. What I will do is intentionally change some of the factors, some of the numbers, or some of the standards, just so that they're not giving away some of the security industry nuance. What is the role of this facility? This facility is going to be providing power to the entire region. And luckily, from looking at it, other than noticing where this power is being generated, be it through wind power, nuclear power, or hydropower, I don't 100% know which one that is. Regardless, it is some type of power station. So it is a critical asset. One of our factors is critical infrastructure. During this part, we would normally be looking for a localized substation or power plant like this to see if it can be compromised. Because if you're trying to compromise, let's say, this town here, but you have a power plant over here, okay, well, just come over here, take control of the power plant, sabotage it, whatever, then you can have an easier time moving in. Be it that the assessment we're performing today is on the critical infrastructure, it's going to be kind of playing hand in hand of our assessment. We'll get more in depth in that later in the video, whenever we get there. So the main role of this facility is to provide power and electrical resources to the entire region. Why is that important? Power in a military context, especially in an occupational context, is an extreme controlling factor. You can decide where power goes and where it doesn't. And we see that during the 1980s, the Soviets regularly completely destroyed villages because they thought they may have been harboring the Mujahideen. If they control the power, they can intentionally shut off power to critical areas before they attack or during an attack, or just to suppress the people there. Power is a critical component. Not only does it disable your enemy from doing a lot of different things, but it also enables your forces to have higher morale because now they get TV night and stuff. So we really, really need to hold this down, even if it's at the sacrifice of some other areas. Let's consider our world guide. The world guide. This is going to be the totality of the universe. Now, MGS takes place in a slightly different alternate universe. Similar, parallel to where we are now, but there are some differences. I am not going to go hugely deep into the MGS lore because, my God, no matter how many videos I watch, I feel like I'm getting further away from understanding. So what I did do is I actually reached out to the Reddit community for Metal Gear Solid, and I had a few people in there really fill in some gaps over this category, national guide and local government guide, that helped fulfill my perspective on everything. Now, whenever I did ask this community, some of the things that may have that I need to be considering during this analysis. One, they pointed out there are large amounts of security contractors or mercenary groups. That's interesting. We didn't see that really until later, after the 90s and 2000s and stuff. So this is a earlier representation of mercenary groups as heavily employed. Mercenary groups have been around for thousands of years, but as heavily employed as they're implying in this universe. That's interesting to note because that means your financial capital as a country or a conqueror is going to be highly leveraged to take advantage of these mercenary groups. For example, if you know company ABC is being paid to come fight you and sabotage your facilities, you can potentially reach out to company ABC and pay them to just not. You can't really do that too much whenever your enemy is a full-on country because they have their own ulterior motives. Mercenary groups, generally speaking, other than the favor of their serving country, are more likely to be swayed by financial means. So leveraging your finances and your economy is going to be much more important in this universe, especially from a security standpoint, than it would be in our real universe. Similarly, we have most of the Soviet occupation actually falls in line with what they actually did. There are some key exceptions. We're not going to go too in depth on those, but most of the Soviet occupation falls in line. There are some exceptions to it considering technology. They are leveraging some Metal Gear tech in this universe, and that is an interesting development. So why do we not see bipedal walkers today? Well, number one, balancing a heavy machine at a higher height gives you a little bit of a mechanical offset of energy. You're more likely to leverage your center of mass off to the side and fall over. If I told you to hold a big heavy barrel above your head, you're more likely to tip than you would be if you held it low to the ground. So what would be the benefit of Metal Gear technology in this universe, a realistic application of them? It would be for rough terrain, such as northern Afghanistan. Bipedal mechanisms technically can conquer rougher terrain much easier than wheels can. We actually see this with some of the Boston Dynamics robots where they can climb up complex structures and stuff, whereas a wheeled vehicle doesn't even stand a chance against that. So in the unique scenario of mountainous terrain, bipedal mechanisms are not a horrible decision. In open combat, though, you may as well use your normal wheeled and treaded vehicles. There are just significant benefits there that outweigh the capabilities of the Metal Gear. Now, some of the things that we need to assess in this overall assessment is what did the Soviets actually do during this particular time? Well, they had a significant military presence in certain areas, and they controlled a huge amount of the logistics trains and routes. This included checkpoints that we actually do see in game, such as here and here. They were a little bit stronger than what's represented in game, but I get it. It's just there to break it up whenever you're traveling from zone to zone. And some of the layered defenses that exist in game would not necessarily exist the way that they do in real life. An example of some of what the Soviet doctrine was during this time and how that might actually be portrayed in game would be based in their positioning. For example, in game, we see that we have this outer wall and a little bit of a perimeter right in this area here. Now, due to their normal arrangement during this time, ideally they would have been using some type of guard post and segmenting or layering of the defensive perimeter. We'll get into this a lot more here in a minute, but we want to see a separation and a dead man's kind of zone in between there. Some of the biggest differences that we see in game that don't perfectly line up with reality and how that practicality could be enforced is with the complacency of the security force. These guys are really kind of just looking off in the random directions. They're not necessarily manning defensive positions and monitoring with overlapping fields of fire and stuff. And generally speaking, and this is going to be a trend in the series, everywhere is understaffed for the demand that they're asking for. There tends to be a lack of redundancy as well. For example, in the case of the power plant that we're going to look at, there's really only one front line. Once you compromise that front line, that front security perimeter, you're just free reign picking off the guards at that point. We would want to protect against that and have overlapping redundancy. One of the other things we want to look at is on the larger scale is their ability to react. So at about this time, 1984 or so, during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the Soviets started creating reactionary forces, be that in the form of a QRF at some local base or some type of QRF based out of helicopters. So if the Mujahideen, say, started creating contact at this perimeter, let's say they were attacking from this mountain and this mountain here, which their attack from high elevation and mountainous areas was fairly common. What the Soviet response actually would have looked like is they would have called in air support from a neighboring area to sweep through and provide hip or hind gunship support or transport troops into the fight who would then outmaneuver the enemy. We did see heavy usage of artillery as well, but unfortunately, because the Mujahideen had learned to really get into those nooks and crannies of the elevation in the mountainous regions of Afghanistan, the artillery was not substantial enough to get in there. Now, in game, we do see some very mild representations of artillery in the sense of a mortar. Unfortunately, it's nowhere near the reality of artillery that they would have actually been employing to secure their facilities and bases and perimeters. For example, in this case here, they would have been dropping artillery all over this position to suppress and pin the Mujahideen, possibly even break their attack. But we don't see it to that scale at all. Similarly, they could have, if they had armor, it would have been forced out to that front line to either reinforce or forced all the way in a counterattack up until the base of the mountain. Obviously, tanks can't drive up the front of mountains, but that's an example of what it really would have looked like. And this type of strategic analysis, be it with responses from other bases, is very, very important whenever we start to consider the actual response of the facility we're going to look at. Some other examples that we don't really see in game, and this definitely is going to fall under a gameplay balance type of thing, is ideally they would be clear-cutting the land. Now, this is totally a tactical espionage game. You're meant to be sneaking up on random bases and kidnapping folks, but we don't see proper security in the sense of clearing out shrubs or trees or other types of obstructions. For the most part, they just have it all letting it grow in as normal, and they're not really monitoring that as much as they should. For example, if you're not able to clear out the shrubs around you, say in a civilian context, you have shrubs that are blocking your security cameras. If you're not allowed to remove those shrubs, you need to see if you can leverage your cameras or your security force to be able to create a visual angle around that shrub. The shrubs, sure, it's not cover, it's not going to stop bullets if it comes to that, but it is a great way to break up that visual outline and conduct surveillance. Now let's go ahead and blend this into the national guide a little bit and the local government guide as well. National guide, according to some of the Reddit posts, this is going to be mostly similar to the reality of Afghanistan as is. So what was the reality of Afghanistan at this time? Well, in the city, the heavily populated areas of Afghanistan, be it the capitals or the other larger cities around there was some acceptance of Soviet occupation, but overwhelmingly the citizenry, even in the cities as well, was not a fan of Soviet occupation, especially in these outlying cities, towns, and villages that we see all over our Afghanistan map. Now, it's important to note in the context of MGS5, there really aren't any citizens that you're coming across, so it's clear, or it's possible to say that the Soviets had completely cleared the citizens off, which very realistic. Soviets had a pretty heavy-handed approach of completely annihilating villages and stuff if they even believed that they were supporting the Mujahideen. So the fact we don't see them in game and they're actually just occupied by the Soviets is a potentially realistic view on what actually happened. Now, from a security analysis point of view, that is a bad idea. Citizenry, though actively may be working against you, can still provide a lot of information. It's kind of the whole drug deal thing where you know somebody's dealing petty drugs, but by getting in contact with that individual, you may be able to find out who the higher level drug dealers are or suppliers are. So if you allow the petty crime, you might be able to find the bigger crime. In the sense here, if you allow the citizenry to just conduct their normal business and you keep surveillance on them, you could potentially have them lead you to those mujahideen that are hiding in the mountains, or the random espionage agents that are sneaking through the desert. Now, we do see a heavy amount of complacency within the guards and stress. You got to remember that the Soviets at this time were kind of a little mixed on this. And whenever it comes to the national guide, we got to consider Russia's perspective on it too. Russia was kind of the perspective they were providing foreign aid in a way. So there may have been some miscommunications to their soldiers as to what they were actually doing there. And when they show up in Afghanistan and they're conducting something opposite of foreign aid, there can be a certain amount of stress that brings upon the soldier and the trooper. These guards are very fatigued. These guards are very tired, and they're really not disciplined appropriately. See, one important note here, and you actually kind of see this in game a little bit. The upper leadership of the Soviets was very top down. They did not allow subordinate commanders. For example, whatever the Soviet version of a sergeant is, they weren't necessarily able to create initiative and make their own decisions. They had to send it up the food chain, get approval from higher up, and then they were able to act. You kind of see that in game whenever you take out a commander. There's a lot more disruption amongst the troops. Now, one of the biggest things we're going to touch on in this particular video is SOPs and Policies, how you advance and clear things. This game is awesome whenever it comes to implementing different types of defenses to whatever your attack methods are. For example, I see a lot of helmets in my gameplay because I headshot a lot of people. Making it harder, which is awesome implementation of gameplay mechanics, but we don't see implementation through policy. For example, throughout my entire gameplay here, I am picking off little stragglers here and there of the Soviet forces to make it a lot easier to take down whatever base I'm dealing with. But they don't adapt their strategy necessarily to forming in teams too very often. They're very likely to still rush in ones and twos, and sometimes in larger groups, but not always. You would want to rewrite your SOPs and policies to involve groups. For example, if you're running a strategic area here, and you have this base, this base, this base, if in this little area here, if this area gets knocked off and you get reports or maybe forensic reports that you can see, oh, well, your guards were killed one at a time. They were in all isolated positions. then you would want to create SOPs that have your guards staying closer together in highly or in dense areas. Let's say you see that get knocked off again. Okay, well, what was the matter there? Oh, well, our vehicles didn't come in to the appropriate route or didn't provide fire support from an effective direction. Okay, well, now we're going to create SOPs that keep all of our guards together, and we're going to pre-plan and stage those response forces ahead of time. Point is, by creating policy and SOPs and standardizing them through rigorous practice and discipline, you can create amazing responses to different events. And this would be a realistic thing. If you have some need for something to happen or you see a problem repeating itself, you are responsible for implementing some type of solution. So that's mostly during our national guide and our local guide here. On the local side, as mentioned a minute ago, we pretty much have cleared out of all the civilians, so we don't have too much civilian to deal with. And we do have highly mountainous terrain to deal with. So how can we create a better security posture at a strategic level here? Number one is going to be decentralizing command. Empower those NCOs to make decisions. If they see an opportunity, say they're in contact right here and you got troops here. If they see an opportunity to outmaneuver this individual, they should execute on that. And they should have the power to do so in the moment that they see that. That would be one of the biggest changes that we can have. And these NCOs need to be able to evaluate some of the previous failures of their command staff. If the NCOs can observe where at the squad level their teams are failing to secure something, they can create counters to better prepare for the next attack. Next up, we would want to see some real counterintelligence stuff going on here. You know that you're being surveilled by the enemy. You don't see too many in the sense of counter surveillance here, or counter snipers, or just information gathering. For example, you can find several times that the Soviets are talking about Snake and his team out there disrupting things, but they really have no idea what's going on. Maybe that's through controlled information. Maybe their upper leadership just isn't sharing that information, or maybe it's just they can't collect that information altogether. I mean, if you're a super sneaky espionage guy that 100%s everything with stealth, yeah, they're not going to have much information to work with. But you would want to see some attempts to try to find out what that would be. In the sense of, we would want to see more guards with binoculars at higher elevation, more posted up in various directions, and 360-degree coverage. Be it the design of the overworld here, we have avenues of approach, such as this bridge. You could have your sentries in a strategic position looking just down on that bridge. Any advance is going to come down that bridge. So by preparing properly, you would be able to identify and prepare against any threats before they actually come into contact with you. Another thing we see is operational unpredictability. We see this in the form of randomized patrols, false routines, just randomly meandering through things and being very predictable in your movements, and decoy activity. Now, if we create decoy activity, for example, we know that there's somebody out there hunting our troopers and they are always going after our resources, for example. We can intentionally stage a misdirection at this bridge and say stage a logistics truck as if it's broken down with a couple of troopers around it. And in hiding, we can have troopers in not necessarily that ambush position, but here and here to provide multiple angles of fire and coverage, ambushing whoever our enemy is. The point is, we don't see very many attempts at all of the Soviet trying to take us out. They're always on the defensive and we are the aggressor. So let's harken on some of the procedural things that we would want to see as well. You're going to see this much more whenever we get to first and second line as well. But take, for example, at this power plant, we have several roving guards at several different positions. Let's say all of these current marks on there are those positions. Now, if we start losing communications, say our comms get knocked out that are on top of this building or the ones on top of this building, whatever the case is, we need to be able to pull this line back into a predetermined overwatch position where all of our guards who are scattered out can now return to an online position where they are overwatched by friendly forces. Now, there's a little give and take in there. As an attacker, you're going to notice that, and you are going to take out the overwatch forces. That way they don't observe you taking out the main line, right? Well, we can't always do that through communications, because if I just knocked out communications, you're not going to have communications as an option necessarily. So, whenever we recreate this little battle line, one or two of your troopers, based on SOPs and practices, is going to be in constant surveillance of the overwatch team. If they begin to get compromised, that guard that's looking back at that surveillance and overwatch team can see, in theory, where that contact is potentially coming from, or where those overwatch guards are returning fire in a direction of, which would give them more information to react upon. We don't see too much of these standard SOPs or any of these engagement practices in play. Now, all of this goes to so. Let's take a look at where we are currently in our analysis. So currently, the passive security is pretty low. So passive security is going to be things in the sense of local informants, which there are none, security cameras, which you can review, radar and other countermeasures. Our passive ability is extremely low already. So if we were to increase this through the use of keeping some of the citizenry intact and allowing cameras to be more in use at some of the posts, we would at least increase it a little bit. At a facility such as this power plant, we definitely need to be seeing some of these in play already. Now, our active is actually fairly high. We have a lot of guards on post. There definitely should be more guards, and they are equipped pretty well. They do equip countermeasures in the sense of body armor, helmets, and heavier weaponry, but they're not strategically placed. So we would want to increase that a little bit through strategic placement and SOPs and training policies. And our response capabilities are laughably low. Yes, there are moments in the high alert status where you get 20 guards rushing at you all at once. Those 20 guards didn't necessarily come from an off-site position, which is partially how it really would have looked. Instead, these are all the guards on post just running at you directly. Now, we should be seeing this support in the sense of heavier weaponry being employed, be it artillery, mortars, heavy machine guns, technical vehicles, gun-mounted transports and stuff, to include tanks and walker gears in the case of this universe. But we would also want to see it in the form of helicopter support. They were notorious for utilizing the hind and hip gunships and transports to outmaneuver and outdestroy the Mujahideen in combat. The fact we don't see that response at all is very, very baffling. Like, don't get me wrong, it's really cool that we have walker gears, but the existence of a helicopter that doesn't care about rocky terrain per se, other than altitude, would be so much more valuable to call on support for. So we really need to see that response capability increased quite a bit. All right, so for reference as where we are going to be looking, we are looking at the Sarak power plants, and this is on the Afghanistan map. Now, right away from the immediate analysis of our first line, the thing we need to note is that MGS5 is not a true free roam in the sense of I am restricted to certain avenues of approach. For example, this high ground all the way around the edge, if I could exploit that, I would. But because it's not in gameplay, we can't necessarily expect the in-game elements to defend against it. So we're going to have a little bit of a compromise here. I'm going to approach this as if it was a legitimate analysis. Therefore, we're going to approach it from the perspective that you could approach from that high ground. Even though you can't, we're going to treat it as if you can. So our first line analysis is going to survey what is observable from the outside. What is keeping me out of the premises? Now, right away, obviously the area that is selected here is very difficult terrain. If I were going to use that high ground advantage, I would need to climb and conquer all that territory. Yeah, I have access to helicopters, and given the state of this universe, they should prepare against that, but that's not always a viable option. So, how could they immediately protect against that type of attack? Number one, the best type of attack that they, or defense that they could do to this, is having air defense systems up on those high ground areas. Now, I know that I can't really do it in game or show it in game, but if they had air defenses along the higher areas and maybe just a surveillance post of maybe 12 guys or so, that would give them extreme forewarning of all of the advancing elements that may be attacking them. We don't see it in game because it's not a thing, but that would be how to protect against that. Let's take a look at what else is on our front line. In my particular playthrough, my enemies are armored up and putting in a lot of different countermeasures, which is good. That'll help with the analysis. Don't mind me as this unprotected logistics convoy passes by me. So my adversaries have body armor and helmets. We also see that we have shields in play. And we can see here that we have night vision in play as well. These are all very good counters to enemy attack. Similarly, we know we have a minefield that's going to be keeping us out. These are good. Minefields are an interesting choice. Now, this is something that more so came out a bit later, but there are some standards about how minefields can be applied and utilized. Now, whether or not standards get implemented in a war zone is a completely different story, but it is one of the expectations. For example, all minefields in a war zone should technically be marked to their depth and extent before, during, and after the entire engagement. That way, in theory, at the end of the fighting, whichever army can pass along those documents to ensure that the mines get safely recovered. That way they don't damage the civilian populace. Whether or not that's going to be a legitimate thing, we don't really know. Now, I can see that I have somewhat marked that zone, whether or not that's due to my partner here, the best partner in the world. Every other partner is wrong. Whether or not that's because of them or some other gameplay element, I'm not 100% sure. But it's worth noting, it is a legitimate technique to put minefields and other types of security perimeters in place. In the context of 1984 Russian or Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, yeah, this is absolutely correct. This is legit. Now, what else do we see from our first line? We see that we do have some form of perimeter fencing here. Whether or not this was the fencing that was already in place before Soviet occupation, or if this was done after Soviet occupation, we don't 100% know, but we can see that it also does not go the entire length of the facility, or there's no barriers on top of this. What I mean by that is, in theory, I could utilize this height advantage to go over it and conquer it. Not a gameplay element, but it is a possibility. Now, general standard security practices are always going to be in layers. Your first layer is a general deterrence. It is a general, hey, you don't belong here, you shouldn't be here. And it shouldn't allow you to get over it. I am getting spotted. I'm going to back off a little bit. A little behind the scenes, a few of the certifications that I have are related to nuclear security and energy security. There are very particular parameters that would be in place for a modern power plant, not quite such as this is 1984, but there are specific techniques that would be in place in a real standard. We're not going to dive too heavily into that. as we are talking about a 30-40 year discrepancy there. But barbed wire on top of this fence line is certainly one of the things we would want to see. Similarly, this particular pipe that is allowing access directly across the top, these can be compromised in a few different ways. Point being that our security perimeter does not necessarily pass down to that point, or at least observe that surface point, is a little problematic. You would station either some type of observation guard, say up on top of this higher roof, that would observe over all of this and prioritize that area. I do like their searchlights and stuff. These are pretty solid for the era that they're in. However, what else can we observe from our position? Now, maybe it's due to the game design and the lighting system. We can see that we have different types of communications dishes at various points. These are clearly observable with the blue light as gameplay balance, which, yeah, I get that. On a legit standpoint, ideally we would kind of consolidate these into two different secure areas. There's no real reason to have them all separated like this, especially with the type of antenna that they are. They would be more capable at a higher elevation. Having them at separate locations is not entirely unreasonable. That way you have redundancy factors, such as, say, on top of this highest point building and on top of this opposite point building. In the event there's a catastrophic failure at one building, you at least have it over at your opposite building. Similarly, if we were going to have an observing sentry, ideally in a minimum team of 2, they can not only observe over all of the patrolling and roving guards, but they can maintain security on the upper level communications, as well as the lower elevation security. Some other things to consider from our first line here, we can see that we have an isolated observation point. This little sandbag row is not horrible, but there's no evacuation route. In the event these guys need to break contact, they can't hold this position. There's not really a safe direction for egress. They're going to be turning their backs to the enemy and have to run in the open for a moment. This is a little bit of poor planning in the tactical sense, especially on the military sense, because citizens aren't really going to be throwing sandbags. We do also have a mortar, which is usually a weapon system that can be placed in the rear for indirect fire. Why it's all the way up front, I don't know. Also, we do not have any type of vehicle ram barriers. At this time, these concrete blocks would suffice for that. Even putting them in a zigzag positioning, forcing a vehicle to slow down in order to make it through, would be a realistic implementation of a barrier. And for this type of facility, you would really do something like that. Lastly, for our first line that we're really going to look at, we don't have any observable cameras. Now, there may be some as I get a little deeper into this facility, but we don't appear to have any cameras right off. Ideally, a camera on this corner here looking over our front sentry post. In the event they get compromised, we would know about it, and we would also be able to identify threats that are on their way in. You can also position cameras at various points on these power poles and stuff that give us that height elevation to look over all of our other infrastructure and determine what needs to be done. Now, in order to do a second line or an inner assessment, I need to take out the area security. So, let me do that right now. While I'm on about our first line here, and I'm at the point, these little delivery points, ideally we would be doing inspections both on pickup and delivery and receiving of a package to ensure that what happens in this game does not actually happen in real life. There are specialized procedures for how those would be done, but we're not going to dive too much deep into here. Not right now. Just as an example of what we were discussing earlier with higher ground observation and stuff, if we had a unit up here on this particular high ground that I'm standing on now, it would be very easy to observe the entire avenue of approach. We can see part of our front sentry. It's unfortunately obscured by this building here. So if we have better positioning of our front sentry, say right about here, make it an L-shaped sandbag position, this would cover their retreat and give us overwatch potentials, and we would be able to see several other lines of egress, such as our roving patrols as they're moving through the facility. One of the big things we're really going to push on in this episode is security procedure. In the event we have good security procedures and SOPs in place, we'd be able to monitor these things. For example, if we had a team posted up top here that's already primarily observing the entry and secondary and tertiary points of ingress, then that would be a good deterrent and capability. But according to SOP, whenever they are on a patrol, say we send out a roving guard to provide security presence out and about and do inspections, we would be able to shift from primary observation areas to passively observing the patrol route to ensure that they're okay. While I maneuver to clear out the rest of the camp, some of the other procedures that we would really want to see are some clear access controls. Now, obviously your security team is not going to be doing the day-to-day work of a power plant. That's going to have to be somebody else, be it third-party contractors or maybe specialists within your own faction. Either way, they got to come in and do their work. So there has to be a way to vet those individuals to ensure that they are properly skilled, tasked, and identified to be who you want. So how do you do that? Well, if they're contractors or citizens or however that's going to work out in this world, you really need a vetting process. Either you're going to pay them off well and vet their background and ensure they are who they say they are, or they're going to be your own employees who are very well paid and looked after. That way they're kept under high morale to make sure they're not compromised and becoming an insider threat. As far as statistics goes, something you may want to know about insider threats, probably part of the reason you may go through mandatory training on the factor, is insider threats have become one of the most concerning factors to Fortune 500 companies. As in, the concern for insider threats has risen to about 60 to 70% as of the past 10 years. Now, what is an insider threat, right? Now, insider threat can be an individual, whether known or not, that has access to sensitive information and could compromise it. Again, known or not. So this could be that they legitimately release the information willingly to some spy or on some public forum for maybe financial gain or safety. But it just as well could be that they do it accidentally, say like some of the leaks that happened to prove a point. Now, I do believe that we have secured the entire facility, so let's go ahead and move on to the second line. Now, some important caveats before we look closer at the second line. We're going to assume, which we know from story missions, that this is deeper into the facility. So even though this is technically an ingress point or a transfer point of valuable information, personnel, and equipment, this is not going to be considered in our assessment. We are only going to consider everything within these valley walls. So, in our second line, we have a severe limitation. We do not have very many deterrents at all, other than some moderate lighting systems that come on later in the evenings. We don't have any second line security systems. We simply have our one front line. That means once the enemy conquers that front line, they now have access to all of our sensitive components and our sensitive facilities. This is very, very bad in a security context. So how, then, could they prepare against that? Well, let's go back and look at our front line a little bit. In the event we push this front line a little bit further out, say at least to the extent of our concrete barrier, and across and up the side of this hill, maybe with the manpower of about 4 security personnel. That way they can support each other in the event they need to move. This would give us layered depth. So at that front line of contact, they can either engage and hopefully dissuade any attacking enemy or adversary from ever coming in, and make all of the initial contacts, be it with locals that are just turned around or possible informants. They can do it further away from the facility. Now, at the second line, right about where we see our first line currently, which would be right about in front of this building, we would want some type of barrier or barricade to stop vehicles from ramming. Now, under the technology of the time, we could make some type of vehicle ram barrier out of our concrete barriers that are already here by serpentining them, forcing a vehicle to slow down. Or we could invest a little bit of money into the site and have some type of raising and lowering gate. That does imply that they have the ability and logistical capabilities to do that. Because we don't seem to... Well, actually, scratch that. We have some of those roadblocks at some of the exterior camps, so they do have the ability. This would be more important than some random roadblock. So, that vehicle barrier should be in place here. Similarly, with the 4 guards at our forward line, we would have another 4 security personnel at our second line here. Ideally, 2 on post, and another 2 that rove from the side of the building all the way down the edge of the wall. These roving guards could support their sentry guards by providing bathroom breaks or just whatever type of relief, be it time to eat or whatever. As stated a moment ago, we would want to do some type of assessment of our deliveries, and we would want to take care of that assessment off-site. Obviously, in the sense of the exact reasoning in game, if there's a problem in the package, we don't want it on site to deal with. So if we had our delivery point further forward, say with our first line, then we can arrange logistics after it's inspected. Now, unfortunately, with the nature of this building, we're going to have to merge our critical infrastructure assessment with our second line. Because here, we see that we have flammable and combustible containers directly on the edge. Now, this building was likely not built after the Soviet invasion and occupation. It was likely built before. So they weren't building this with the intent to defend against a military takeover. So, if you are a military and you have something like this on the edge, and this is presumably sensitive equipment to the operation of the facility, you need a barrier between this and your adversary, be that a solid concrete wall or some type of netting that can at least stop some projectiles. Now, is that going to stop an anti-material rifle? No. But if we put a concrete wall there, then we're probably blocking some of our point of view and observation capabilities. So depending on which protection method we go against, we may have to invest in additional protection. For example, if we extended this concrete wall down, we may want to put cameras on the outside of that wall. Now, in the sense of critical infrastructure, not all of the electrical components can be compromised from the outside, and especially under 1980s technology, some of these can be. For example, This particular component, not going to go in depth on it because I am not an electrician. What would happen if it got a bullet through it? Did I just compromise this entire facility from the outside? Maybe. Now, for the value of the assessment, you can't protect against everything. There is going to be a convenience to security threshold that we need to stay within, and that might not be within it. Again, this building was built probably before the military operation, so it wasn't necessarily built to protect against a military operation. We do see that we have some steel plating here. These can create some trip hazards and stuff. Under a military context, you do what you can with what you've got, so not too bad here. And our forklift does appear to be usable in off-road conditions. Oh, and they properly chock the wheels. These operators have good security procedures. Forklift operators, that is, not necessarily the security on site. Now, at our first doorway directly into the building, we don't appear to have any access control requirements, be it badge readers or any other type of volumetric or any other type of assessment abilities. There do not appear to be any cameras outside of here, which there may be, just not in my playthrough. It's hard to say for sure. Now, I know we can't go into the rest of this building, but considering the first entryway has no security procedures, I would assume it's probably going to be a consistent factor. Another thing I want to touch on is their ability to deploy these little rubber guards. This is actually really awesome to see, and we do have real-world use of these. I won't be throwing any names out there, but I do know of some facilities that use very lifelike mannequins to guard less than ideal positions. As we can see as I move through the facility, we have sensitive equipment all around. Now, even though this is beyond our first security perimeter, we would still want to see segmented or segregated gates around these to ensure that the employees aren't wandering around where they shouldn't be. For example, every facility needs somebody that's going to come around and clean the toilets and take out the trash. Once they get past the initial security, they don't need to have the ability to walk in to this critical area. Because if that lowest paid janitor gets compromised outside of the workplace, they can then come over here and become an insider threat, be it by providing information or by actively sabotaging the facility. As an example of that segmented and segregated positioning here, we have more combustible containers that are protected by a chain link fence, which this is good to see. This is the same type of fencing that we would want around some of the rest of our components out here in this yard. This particular room was some type of communications array for the security team. Whether or not this was an impromptu security post set up, I'm not 100% sure. Considering it had the main communication system, I'm assuming so. It's honestly not bad positioning, but we do need to make sure we have the manpower to hold a building like this. For example, there was really only one guard posted here, and they were patrolling. We would need more than that. Some type of access point like this that gets us around back of a sensitive room would need to be access controlled. You could simply do this just by throwing, say, planks over the top and weighing them down, or something else, such as a deliberate no-climb barrier. For granted, they don't work all the time, but it's a good consideration. Now, this here brings up an interesting point. A sandstorm that is going to compromise our visibility amongst the entire site is a very common thing, and it's a weather pattern we would need to prepare for. Now, there are certain tools that just won't work in a sandstorm. For example, night vision technology uses infrared lasers or infrared light to see. Infrared light can be blocked by sand. Thermal can be blocked by a sandstorm. Those are particulate that are in between you and the thermal signature. That particulate is going to disrupt the thermal signature, so that's not going to work all that great. It's going to have some penetrating capability, but not amazing. If you happen to do the whole tin can and rope string method, that's not going to work because the blowing of the wind is going to disrupt it constantly sending off a signal. There are some other systems, such as radar technology, that could in theory assist in this moment, but not likely. It's not likely to be a viable option for the Soviets of this particular era. So, how could we prepare against this? By having patrol density. Unfortunately, in a sandstorm like this, we can't afford to just hunker down and bend down and hold our own. If we change our SOP requirement to in a sandstorm, everybody gets online and everybody eyes up, then that will at least help us. For example, our guards up here at the top won't be able to observe anything during that sandstorm, other than possibly lights that may or may not be present. So if, for example, during the start of this sandstorm, all troopers turned on the flashlights, these guys up here would be able to observe that flashlight. The problem with doing that is that flashlight is going to give away where the soldiers are looking, so that's not a hugely viable option. Sometimes you can see glow sticks used for a similar function, where they will put glow sticks on their back, and if that glow stick is compromised in some kind of way, that's a means to investigate. This all goes to say, during a sandstorm, there's not an amazing amount we can do other than officers just observing their areas, monitoring their areas, and looking out for each other. Ideally, all officers should be able to see each other during this observation moment. Now let's take a look at some of our principal assets in digital resistance. Digital resistance during the 1980s is a very hard thing to gauge because digital, as we know it today, is not the same as 1980s digital resistance. For the most part, as long as we're protecting against general munitions and invasion of our security line or telephone lines and stuff, we should be able to protect against this. For example, these power lines, are they only power lines? I can tell you now by design that these normally are only power lines, but if they're also transmitting telephone lines, that telephone line can be intercepted down the way. A form of digital resistance would be, how can we observe for that? And the Soviets did have some technology for monitoring to make sure that their systems weren't being compromised, be it their communication systems, and we would want to see those in place here too. As for our principal asset, it is the primary power generation. Now, that would be our controls within this building that unfortunately we don't get to explore very much into, and our impromptu security headquarters on the side here would need to be a principal asset, as well as our substation controls, which unfortunately, because there are no fences, would be the entire facility for the most part. And we're also going to look at response capabilities. Now, the Soviets were very well known for some of their abilities to respond. They used hammer and anvil tactics, where there would be troops deployed by helicopter in a nearby area, and they would hold position, whereas ground troops would push the enemy into that helicopter squad, forcing them into an ambush. Now, Soviets were also very well known for their air capabilities in general through the hip and hind helicopters. We do not see any type of hip or hind response that came and countered me. At a critical facility such as this, we need a response in play. Regardless where that may be on our map, it needs to be a possibility.
Plant expansion complete.
Now, this is a fairly narrow area to land, but if we were to land a helicopter out here, that would only put them a few hundred meters away from the ability to respond. Or if we had defense in depth, where we had more defenders inside of our facility in this mountain that were able to come out and assist, that would be a great value. Unfortunately, as mentioned in a previous episode, the best thing that they could have done to protect this facility better would just be by providing more security personnel. If we have to sacrifice a few checkpoints to make that happen, it would be a viable choice. Why would that be? Well, what do you gain from the checkpoint? You gain general security in the area and access denial to your adversary. You also gain the ability to know generally what's in a vehicle or on a person's body. However, this can be seen as a little disruptive too, a little disruptive to the overall mission. So if we were able to take those 4 to 10 guards from a remote post and place them here, that would be much more ideal. Because instead of having to deal with vehicles and the occasional foot traffic that may come through, you're now able to secure your entire power grid for a certain area. The loss of power can be extremely detrimental to the morale and capabilities of your military force. So, this is much more important than some random checkpoint. So just as a quick recap, pushing our front line and first line a little bit further forward, adding 2 more additional guards onto that position in a line of depth up the hill as well. Having a second line that has a vehicle ram barrier and 4 more guards to patrol not only the specific sentry post and up and down the wall would be a great security asset in depth. Also, having some barriers between some of our sensitive components would be a great help as well. And we would also want to see some type of air defense on the ridge or infantry observation with binoculars, maybe even sniper rifles and heavy weapons, but really just binoculars to protect against potential air attacks. Similarly, we need fencing and segmenting of our critical components here to keep unwarranted access out. Just because you can get on site does not mean you should be standing next to some of the critical components. We also want some segmenting of our communications, some on top of the building, and some on top of a separate building. In the event one building gets compromised, we still have overall communications. If we were able to institute, say, cameras and more guards, we would better be able to protect the entire site overall. Then maybe cameras aren't an option, but by pulling some of those forward vehicle checkpoints, we would be able to provide more security capabilities here. Some secondary capabilities with defending our ladder systems and our doors to critical areas would also be greatly implemented. This doesn't always have to be in the, say, way of badge readers or lock doors, but at least separating them through multiple doors can help in some cases. And our last area that they could have done better on would just be in their overall response capabilities. There was really no response. For granted, it wasn't really detected in that moment, but where would the response come from? Traditionally, according to Soviet doctrine, it would be through helicopters or nearby armored reinforcements. We don't see either one of those nearby, but it could be assumed that that would be what lies behind this gate, even if we don't see it in this particular event. Overall, the security here could be better, and it's mostly and entirely just looked at as could have been better from the sense of just more manpower. That's all we have for the MGS5 evaluation and analysis of security analysis here. And overall, they really did some things great and some things not. Whether or not it's just incompetence of the leadership or if it's just totally leaning into gameplay balance, I don't know which the case is. But I do like to imagine how much more difficult it would be if some legitimate security practices and procedures were actually implemented. This is all we have for this episode. Feel free to vote for the next one. I'm looking forward to it. Let me know what you think. Thank you. Bye. All right, little Q&A time here. If this is your first time here, I am going to be reviewing questions that I didn't quite get around to, or maybe I left unanswered intentionally from the previous episodes. Now, we're still doing this pretty early, so we don't have a huge amount of comments to dig off of. However, we do have one commenter, the real Jeff too, who suggested using a specific base in Ghost Recon Wildlands for an analysis. And I am absolutely interested in doing that. They actually specifically state looking at some areas within the Media Luna and some of the bases that involve the Unidad, which I am extremely interested in. Now, I was a little leery of doing anything with Wildlands just due to the context of cartels and stuff. I'm not trying to give cartels pointers. So, in the context of looking at a Unidad facility, yeah, I could probably get around to that, no problem. So, we'll include that as a vote at some point soon. The last comment that we're going to take a look at was on a slightly different video here. It's still a security analysis. It's by Leon Peters Malone, 3054. It said, what he said about the lack of quick reaction force reinforces is why I put in a mod called Fear the Radio. Running firefight when you have multiple groups coming in at gunships really makes you take your time. Yeah, so Ghost Recon Breakpoint was a great example of failed potential. You have this awesome potential of a professional security force who is there to, de-escalate anything and be aggressive on any form of insurrection. And they have a lot of capability when it comes to drones and air power, but they failed to utilize any of it in a counter effect or a counterattack or response capability. In fact, why have all of those assets at all if they're not actually going to employ them to be aggressive? They are coming off in almost all of their engagements as very defensive and failing to seize any form of initiative. Which, if you play Breakpoint, you can find many times where you have a potential to be attacked. You're a vulnerable moment where you wrap it up and stuff, healing some injury. But the enemy just doesn't seize that advantage through fire superiority or outmaneuvering. Why you don't see that? Gameplay balance. They want to give you some form of chance. Maybe it's a certain design element within Ubisoft games where they want to baby step and handhold a little bit to allow the player to know what they're doing every